Good morning and welcome to the first ever India pop-up at GSV. My name is Kami Vishwanathan and I'm founder of Work 4.0 Capital, a cross-border investment firm focused on the future of work. Over the last 10 years, I founded and ran an educational content and tech company based here in the US and in India and also in Germany and Bosnia. We grew to over 3,000 people and were acquired a couple of years ago. Over the last couple of years, I've spent a substantial amount of time researching and analyzing the India market and trying to develop insights into what works and what doesn't, and happy to share some of those insights with you today.
Hi, good morning everybody. A very warm welcome and thank you for being the select few who are here. So just as, I think you have our bios already, so I won't give much background, but just the context with which we're coming to this conversation. So I've been an entrepreneur in early education for the last 10, 12 years in India, and subsequently just switched to investing into education with two pools of capital, one which is philanthropic and one which is financial. Over the years, I think we've been coming to ASU GSV and we started getting a lot of questions, which is what is the right time to look at India? What are some of the challenges in India? How do we think about India? And so we thought with the organizers, it might be nice to just have a conversation to share really two things. The first is a presentation where we're going to do predominantly for people who are new to India. So it's about half an hour where we'll talk about what does the macro picture of India look like, population growth, things like that. A second piece of it is going to be around what does the education basic landscape look like? What is the size, scale, nature of the education landscape? And then finally, what are therefore some of the opportunities we see emerging in EdTech? And so that's the kind of first half an hour. And then after that, we're going to have two panels to really try to bring to life what this means on the ground with some practitioners, investors, and entrepreneurs who are working on the ground. So with that, I'll hand over to Kami to start, and then I'll come back on and subject you to some pain of my conversation in the middle. Yeah, thanks.
So when we talk to people about India, we most often hear that it's very interesting, but also somewhat intriguing. A growing economy, a large market, an English-speaking population, but also a complex opportunity that requires nuanced understanding. So what we're hoping to do today with this presentation, like Anshul said, is to help peel the layers and talk about the macro and then the education sector and then some opportunities. So starting off with the macro environment, India's had growth rates of over 7% each year for the last 5 years. And this has been driven by growth in the services sector and in infrastructure, and also backed by solid industrial production. And this is expected to continue to grow at 7.5% for the next 5 years. Foreign investment into India has been growing and strong, and on the back of a stable currency and manageable inflation. And both Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs have rated India overweight for 2019. India has also gone up 2 years in a row in the World Bank's ease of doing business rankings, potentially reflecting some of its efforts to simplify permits and approvals for setting up new businesses, and also rationalization of the tax regime, most recently with the introduction of the goods and services tax. India has a very young population, a median age of just 29 years, a young, large workforce with 1 million people coming into the workforce each month. We've had relative political stability over the last few years with the BJP-led national government. We have elections upcoming as we speak, but the general consensus seems to be that irrespective of the results, while there might be some short-term impact, long-term continuity and growth is unlikely to be affected. Looking a level deeper, I think there are a couple of questions that come up that require understanding. And the first is whether the growth has been a jobless growth. Official employment data in India is as of 2011 and 12, so it's a bit dated. But private studies have shown that unemployment has gone up, particularly in the last year or two, and the rate of job creation is not keeping up with the rate at which jobs are required, which is expected to be anywhere between 8 to 13 million jobs a year. Most people agree that the rate of job creation is at 5 to 5.5 million, which obviously reflects a gap. Having said that, however, India has a large unorganized sector, and out of the 474 million people or so in the workforce, only 25 to 30 million are in the corporate organized workforce, and the rest are in agriculture and in small businesses and in self-employment, which are harder to track. So it is likely that there has been job creation in the unorganized sector, But these tend to be low-value jobs, which don't offer subsistence wages for families, and hence we potentially have an underemployment or a wages problem as well. The other factor is that women's labor force participation in India has come down over the last 15 years from 42% to 27%. And this is despite greater levels of educational attainment by women. And this, at least partly, is due to the fact that there are probably lesser jobs, particularly in rural areas, for more qualified women. Both these structural issues, the unorganized sector as well as women's labor force participation, I think represent big opportunities as one thinks about business and investment in the sector. The other question that comes up often is whether India really has a large consumer market. The Economist came out with an article last year stating that if you define middle class based on the global definition of earning more than $10 of income a day, India's middle class is probably more in the 70 to 80 million range as opposed to the purported 300 million. And while one could argue that even at that level, at that size, it is a sizable market and companies can and have built businesses for that segment, if you define the segments based on current poverty lines in India, there is just short of 500 million people right above the poverty line, and a third of that above that. And both these segments are seeing significant upward mobility. And while businesses have to be cognizant about affordability and pricing models when targeting these segments, it is to be noted that education is a priority area of spend because it is seen as a factor for upward mobility. And this is probably reflected in some of the traction that consumer EdTech businesses have seen in the recent past in India. Over the last few years, there have been some remarkable developments driven by technology. Rapid mobile phone penetration with 3 out of 4 Indian adults owning a mobile phone, reduced data costs with the introduction of Reliance Jio, creation of a national digital identity through the Aadhaar system akin to a social security system, and also creation of a mobile-based national digital payment system have all contributed to a whole new set of people getting access to information and communication and products and services. And the Omidyar network came out with a research report which talked about how the full benefits of market inclusion could be leveraged for these populations and what still needs to happen for that to take place. And the first thing was that internet penetration needs to improve, particularly as it pertains to women users of the internet and rural users. India's had one of the highest user growth rates with internet use, with 40 million new users each year over the last 5 years. So this number is slated to go up from 28% where it stands now to 59% in the next couple of years. The other factor is online spending per buyer, and so levels of economic activity on the internet continue to be low in India, though there is more usage. And therefore, and that stands at $224 per person per year, which is, I think, an eighth or 10th of the equivalent number in China, and hence needs to go up. But it is slated to go up given that online sales has grown over 70% for the last 5 years. So I think India has a real opportunity to leverage its young population and witness a period of rapid growth driven by consumption. But for that, we need jobs, and we need the right people in jobs. So there needs to be a focus on job creation and also on moving jobs from the unorganized sector to the organized sector, and on improving women's labor force participation. But more importantly, in order to really leverage the population and reap the demographic dividend, India needs to make a significant investment in human capital, all the way from K-12 and higher ed to training and skilling and finding new means of engagement to leverage and identify new and non-traditional pools of talent. And this is probably a good segue to our next section, which is an overview of the education and talent sectors in India.
Okay. Thank you. So what I'm going to try and do is a couple of things. One is just to give you a little bit of a sense of the size and scale of what we're talking about across segments of education, both in terms of number of people and market size, and then subsequently give you a little bit of a glimpse of each of the sectors, so early ed, K-12, higher ed, in turn, right? And I think what's important, and this is what I've highlighted because it's such a wide topic to cover in 10 minutes, is a little bit of a sense of what is the quality and size issues, what's the role of the private sector in these segments, and what's the regulation like covering these different segments. So here, if you look at overall population, you always hear about this huge Indian population, right? And this really tries to bring that to life. And if you look out of that $1.3 billion, and it's a couple of years dated, but we have about more than 500 million people who are in the formal education segment, both public and private, of which actually some are officially in the system and some are outside of the formal system. So those out of the 550 who are in the formal education system are actually about 300 plus million. And off that, in the private sector itself, you have about 120 million young people across early ed, K-12, higher ed, vocational training. The growth is pretty significant in both, as you'll see. You have, when you look at this in conversion in terms of market size, 50% of the overall market size of about 67 billion is coming from K-12 education. Another 35% or so is coming from higher ed, and the remaining is really a cross between tuition and test prep and pre-K. The growth rates are pretty significant across the board. So you're seeing 10-12% growth in both K-12 and higher ed, and slightly higher growth in tuition and test prep. And I know Zishan's going to talk a little bit about that in one of the panels, so I'll leave that for later. So let me talk a little bit about early ed, right? I think world over, there is a greater understanding that early ed is fundamentally important for brain development and for young people, right? And so there's a greater attention across the world in early ed, and therefore gross enrollment ratios, or GERs, are going up in early ed across the world. In India, we're relatively not yet seeing that happen. And so there is a feeling that that's changing, and there's a large headroom for growth in early ed to catch up to other countries, which is generally the progression you see as countries develop. So in that early ed, there's actually two segments of opportunity. One segment is around more traditional preschool, which is where you'll see more educational programming. And there's a second, which is around childcare. So there's an interesting act that's been passed recently where all corporates above a certain size in India have to provide access to childcare services for their employees. So Kami talked a little bit earlier about women in the workforce, their participation going down. So this is one of the things the government is trying to do to support women going back into the workforce. And so as a result, we had invested in an early education business, which was traditionally preschool, but in the last couple of years, childcare has really taken off in a very fundamental way. So this is clearly an opportunity segment. There is competition, as it says there. A lot of the large K-12 schools are actually starting to offer preschool services themselves, and there's a lot of new providers who see this opportunity and are entering, and it's unregulated, so therefore it is attracting private sector interest. So we think there's going to be growth. We also think there's going to be consolidation, and some quality players are going to start to come to the top. So that's kind of a picture of early ed. So K-12. The numbers you've seen are very, very large. And what we've seen in general, what we hear in the press, is there's been great improvements in enrollment rates into K-12 education. What is also very clear, though, even though children are in schools, they are not learning, right? That's a very bold statement, but if you look at the numbers, there's a very clear learning crisis, as the World Bank calls. So this graph really shows what percentage of children are at grade level in both literacy and numeracy when you look at them at standard 3. So have they learned what they should have learned in standard 2? And the numbers recently are around 28% of children are at grade level, right? So there's a very clear need for upgradation of quality. Within that market that we talked about, because quality is so poor, you're seeing private sector starting to play a large role and a much larger role over time in provision. So while this shows maybe about 25% private provision, if you actually looked at the number of children who are in private schools, it's much, much larger. So we're talking about maybe about 45% of children in private schools. So even though the number of schools is less, there's a larger population self-selecting into those schools. And you are seeing significant growth, so that proportion is going to continue to change. Though that 7% in the last couple of years has come down slightly, it is still growing as a percentage. The last thing I'll point out here is really if you look at price points are very low. And this is, I think, a central question I hear from a lot of people coming from outside. What is the monetization capability? And we're going to talk about that a little bit on the panels. So this is an average, so please realize there's a very wide range from this kind of $200, $250 a year number. There's a very wide range on that number. So regulation, really I have two of the people who I think are the most respected and who should really be presenting the side, who are Vivek and Arushi, who are sitting in the front from Nishit Desai Associates. So if you want to deep dive, you should really speak to them. But I'm going to give you a glimpse around regulation on both K-12 and higher ed. So on K-12, even though we have private institutions, interestingly, legally, you can't set up a school unless you are a not-for-profit or a trust or a society, with the exception of a couple of states. So in general, you need to be structured as a not-for-profit. So what has happened with the large private players, as well as some of the private equity firms, is that they structure private management companies that service those trusts, and those entities can make profit. And I think that has been kind of developed as a kind of standard norm, which seems to be lasting now the test of time. I think there's important nuances of doing arm's length transactions and things which you could get in a further conversation. Other than the formal structuring, there's also a number of laws that you need to think about. You need to get a no objection certificate from the state. You need to follow RTE or certain federal norms and provide a certain number of spaces from children from certain backgrounds. And you also need to follow the rules around the board that you choose to follow. So there's different boards that you can follow in India. So it's a highly regulated space. Having said that, private players and blue chip private equity firms are comfortable participating in that space. So on higher ed, again, there is, if you look at public and private provision, for the same reasons that I talked about in K-12 education, where learning, the quality of learning is not as high as we would like it to be, there's very large private participation also in higher ed. And you almost see about 55, 60% of provision as a whole from private enterprise. Now, that's not to say that the quality of those private schools is across the board better. Actually, both in the K-12 private providers and the higher ed providers, if you look at learning outcomes, if you take out the top schools, the next layer of schools are actually not that much better, but there is a perception that they're better. And I think the central issue around quality is really around, are we learning the skills we want to learn to be employable? Because people want upward mobility and they want jobs which they'll be paid for. And it's not clear whether that alignment, which is true, I think, world over. In the United States, there's also, I think, a big conversation around the connection between higher ed and employability. That's certainly true in India. And so there's a whole separate segment outside of, I'm talking more about formal education, but there's a whole skilling segment, which is a big conversation in and of itself. So while the numbers are large, this really talks about this point which I was saying, which is quality is low. And the way I'm kind of interpreting that is if you look at the number of applicants that are there for the top schools versus the mid or lower schools, I should be diplomatic, between different schools, if you look at the IITs and the IIMs, which is really what everyone knows around the world, you're talking about more than 200 applicants per position on average across the school network. Whereas if you look at it in other types of colleges, it's far lower. And so, you read in the press, I think there's been a number of articles that have come out that these are the most competitive schools in the world because there's a shortage of good quality positions that are relevant. Again, there is the formal education, higher education system is highly regulated. There is an informal sector. I mean, it depends how you want to really coin these words. So the formal is more around universities and colleges and technical professional colleges. And then the informal is around what you are seeing, and there's a number of providers on our panel, which is around certificates, which is an unregulated space. And so again, I'll defer to the NDA folks if you want to have a further conversation on that. So I think that provides you an overall sense of the formal education sector. And I think as you look for opportunities, it's important to understand what are the issues and therefore what are the opportunities that are emerging for private entrepreneurs. And so given the quality issues that we're describing across the spectrum, you're seeing a number of private players, both EdTech and non-EdTech, coming in to really try and address different issues. And so I think Kami's going to talk a little bit about that, so I'll hand back over to her.
So I think we have a learning crisis and an employability crisis in India, and therefore there are several areas within the pre-K through grade spectrum for intervention and improvement. But not all of them may be as attractive from an investment point of view, either because they're highly regulated or because of complex market dynamics. So if you look at where the investment interest has been over the last couple of years, in 2018, just short of $760 million went into EdTech companies in terms of venture capital investment. And this number was a fourth of that in the previous year, so a significant jump there. Now, granted that a good portion of that investment went into one company, Byju's, but most of these companies are starting to see traction in terms of users and in terms of paid subscribers. And that probably reflects some of their aggressive marketing and selling strategies, including door-to-door sales, to tap into the propensity of this mid and high-income segment in India to pay for education and advancement. So EdTech is expected to be a $2 billion opportunity by 2021. And that includes supplemental online content and services across the spectrum from primary education to higher ed and beyond, and includes test prep, reskilling and online certification, and language and other learning. This just gives you a sense of the pace of investments we've seen over the last couple of years, last several months actually. And some of these companies and investors are here today, and we'll hear more from them in the panel discussions. So as we see it, there are a few areas which we see as opportunities for businesses and are attractive as investment areas. And one of them is skilling and lifelong learning. So online models with industry touch points that address new age skills, digital and coding skills and communication skills, either tied up with colleges and universities or targeting the post-college, pre-employment and early career professional market could be interesting. The important thing here though is affordability and providing tangible outcomes for learners, either in terms of a job guarantee or a pathway to employment in terms of a staffing or apprenticeship opportunity. The real scale in this segment as we see it is in the mid-mass market, but of course affordability is a factor here. The other area is college recruitment and internships. Right now in India, only the top colleges have companies coming to campus to recruit graduates, and to be able to democratize this process and provide access for graduates across the country in all colleges to have access to employment, maybe platforms where we can have employers and colleges and graduates where you have internships to help companies kick the tires and for students to get to know companies better. Could be an interesting area. The other is gig platforms. There seems to be latent demand in tier 2 and 3 cities for supplemental income through gig work. And while companies today may not be set up to handle a large distributed gig workforce, an intermediary like a staffing company or similar could potentially consolidate gig work and work with companies. The other wide open space or white space as we see it is digital credentialing. So the low-hanging fruit, of course, here is conversion of paper certificates and diplomas to online credentials and badges, digital badges. But the real potential, I think, is in creating industry-wide standards and benchmarks. So you make skills comparable across jobs and companies and industries and really make it a currency in the employment market. And that then has relevance not just in a learning context, but also in a work context with performance as a tool for performance recognition and management. K-12 and test prep, this is an area that's seen a lot of venture capital interest. There seems to be a growing demand for online curricular supplemental content and tutoring services, potentially reflecting directly on the quality of education in schools, which is not adequate. And parents want better outcomes in terms of grades and test achievement for their kids and are willing to pay for online content and tutoring. An estimated 70 million or so of kids in India, school kids in India, attend tuition classes. And the quality of these tutors is very variable. So to have online quality content and also provide access to a larger number of people is a big draw. Personalized content and adaptive learning could also be drivers for growth in this area. I also wanted to point out a couple of opportunities based on just the rapid mobile phone penetration that we're seeing, especially in tier 2 and 3 cities and in rural areas. And this is a nascent area, and affordability as well as real-time access could be limitations. But nevertheless, I think language learning is one such where, especially English language learning, given the low level of proficiency in schools for reading and literacy, and also the growing importance of English as something to increase employability, especially driven by some of the e-commerce companies that expect a basic level of proficiency for their partners. This could be interesting. And the other area is micro-learning, or bite-sized how-to learning for vocational skills and task-based skills, potentially targeted at the unorganized sector, so self-employed folks and small and medium businesses could again be interesting. Again, nascent area, but growth potential. So in summary, I think education in India is at the cusp of a massive growth and change driven by EdTech. And there are significant opportunities across the spectrum for private players to come in early and create categories of products and services and build brands. I think the important things to focus on are affordability and outcomes for learners. And of course, in India, I think plug-and-play approaches don't work very well, especially in a nascent sector like EdTech. So an investment in the ecosystem with a long-term perspective is probably critical to success. So these are just some high-level thoughts and insights, and every opportunity, of course, is unique, and every sector is unique. And having a well thought out plan and the right partnerships are probably half the battle won. We have a couple of panel discussions coming up, one on skilling and building a future-ready workforce, and the other on building consumer businesses in pre-K through 12. And if you further would like to discuss a specific opportunity, we'd be happy to meet one-on-one if you'd like to find us after the panel discussions. Thank you.
We'll take a minute.